So Venus normally, in terms of its orbital cycle, usually takes about a year or so to do a complete orbit through the zodiac. And normally Venus moves forward through the zodiac at about one sign every 3 or 4 weeks. When it's doing its normal direct motion through the signs of the zodiac, going from 0 to 30 degrees in each sign, and in the normal, counterclockwise motion through the zodiac from Aries to Taurus to Gemini and so on and so forth. However, periodically, Venus will go retrograde, which is when it slows down and it starts moving backwards for 40 days. Instead of going through its normal movement of going counterclockwise, it starts going clockwise. So it literally slows down and it starts moving backwards in its normal motion.
And sometimes that can take it into the preceding sign as well, if that, if that happens to cross the sign boundary.
Right. So the retrograde or Venus retrograde period is just that span of time, especially right in the middle of that process when it's moving backwards.
And the middle of the retrograde is when Venus retrograde is conjunct the sun. That's basically when Venus passes between the Earth and the sun. So that's another way to conceptualize it astronomically. What's happening is Venus is coming closest to the Earth and making that alignment between Earth and the sun.
Yeah, so today on June 13th, we see that Venus is at 7 degrees of Leo, and what will happen is we see Venus is moving forward through the sign of Leo, and it's moving forward in the order of degrees from, let's say, 18 degrees to 19 to 20 to 21. But the closer we get to the retrograde station, Venus actually starts slowing down so that it's not moving through those degrees as quickly. And then eventually, when we get to here, about late July, around July 22nd, Venus will actually stop moving forward at 28 degrees of Leo, and it will turn retrograde and begin moving backwards for 40 days. And going from 28 Leo, it'll move to 27 Leo, then 26, then 25, and so on and so forth. And then eventually, as Patrick said, about at the exact midpoint or halfway point through the Venus retrograde cycle, Venus will conjoin the sun and have an exact conjunction right in the heart of the sun. So then eventually we get the second half of the Venus retrograde cycle, and it keeps going backwards in the order of degrees until eventually in late August and early September, it starts slowing down again, and Venus will station direct at 12 degrees of Leo here around September 3rd and September 4th, at which point it will then start moving forward again.
That's right. And we might add that what happens over the course of this motion is as the retrograde starts, Venus is visible in the evening sky after the sun is set in the west. And then gradually, as the retrograde progresses, it comes under the beams of the sun where it's not visible for much of the retrograde, although eventually, towards as it approaches its direct station, it becomes visible again, but this time as a morning star preceding the sun in the eastern horizon, rising before the sun in the morning.
Yeah, for sure. So it begins the cycle as an evening star, where it's visible at night after the sun sets, and it ends the cycle as a morning star, where it's visible in the mornings just before the sun rises. So the general point is just Venus gets really far away from the sun, and then at the retrograde it turns and starts moving back towards it. But both ends of the retrograde are sort of in some way connected with Venus being as far from the sun as she can get, because she can never get more than 2 signs away from the sun, or about how many degrees? It's like 40 something degrees.
40.
Yeah. One of the last important things astronomically is that Venus retrogrades only happen for the most part in about 5 signs, right? Because Venus will go retrograde every 18 months, but it actually has a pretty fixed pattern that it creates across the signs of the zodiac.
Yeah, it's a very symmetrical cycle. The full Venus cycle is 2,920 days, which is 8 years minus 2 days. And so if you think of 8 years being a circle, the 5 retrogrades happen sort of in a symmetrical pattern apart from each other. And this is what illustrates the image of a 5-pointed star.
Venus will go retrograde in one of these 5 signs roughly every 18 months. And then what's weird about it is that it will repeat the same retrograde in roughly the same sign of the zodiac every 8 years. So I've got a diagram up right now that shows some of the Venus retrograde dates. And so when we're talking about this current one that's about to happen in Leo between July and September of 2023, that's going to happen in Leo. And if we go back 8 years to the summer, the same time frame of July, September of 2015, we'll see Venus also going retrograde in roughly the same area of the zodiac. And then if we go 8 years before that to 2007, July to September, we'll see Venus going retrograde again in roughly the same spot.
Knowing following the Venus retrogrades, it really comes in very, very handy, because any chart you look at, you immediately have a sense of how Venus operates in that chart if you understand the cycle.
Little side note as well is that the relationship of the number of retrogrades and the number of Earth years to take place in 5 retrogrades within 8 years, that technically forms the golden ratio 1.6.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of another interesting aspect.
Right.
About
the
cycle.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the like mathematical formula are replicated in, or actually like are in nature and show up in nature in different ways. And then that also comes through in different ways in which it's connected to time and our experience of time, and through astrology also our realization of a different or our experience of a different dimension of time, that time has a much more qualitative side to it than we're usually used to thinking of. All right, so those are the basics of Venus retrograde in terms of what it means, what it is astronomically, just as an astronomical cycle. Let's talk a little bit about what Venus retrograde actually means from an astrological standpoint.